My name is Elizabeth Pschorr, and you're watching me and my story on Boing Boing.
On the eve of Adolf Hitler's Third Reich, a young woman of Jewish descent married an Aryan man. The Nazis would later classify that as a privileged marriage, which would save her life while millions died. Her name is Elizabeth Pschorr. This is her story. Elizabeth and Friedel first met when they were kids. Friedel came over to her house to play with her brother, and she never paid much attention to him. But when they hit their teens, something sparked.
My brother and Friedel came to pick me up to take me on a trip through the German mountains. And I sat there with Friedel, and he said to me, you know, actually we should write to each other.
Once, Friedel wrote to her, "Now 2 weeks have passed when I was allowed to be with you. 2 weeks where I was so close to you. I don't know which day or which hour was the most lovely. I only know that from the first to the last breath that I took, every day that I was conscious, I would only think of you." And she replied, and he replied, and love grew through words over the next 3 years. Tradition didn't allow them to spend much time alone, so the letters were the closest they could get. But because Friedel was her brother Eric's friend, he often stayed over in one of the family's guest rooms.
I remember that one time, I don't know which year, I snuck up in my nightgown on the maid's stairs, you know, in the back of the house, and I was scared to death. My father would come out and see me going upstairs, and excuse me all, I lay in his bed and embraced him, and he didn't even kiss me, because that was forbidden.
Far greater challenges to their closeness loomed ahead. Friedel's family was Christian. Elizabeth and her family were of Jewish descent, but non-practicing. To the Nazis, it didn't matter whether or not you went to synagogue. Elizabeth remembers the first time she became aware of what it would mean to be a Jew in Nazi Germany.
I had a girlfriend. She was blonde and pretty, Helga Hübner, and obviously a Christian Irish. We were perhaps 8 years old. And all of a sudden the Jewish kids were isolated, and so Helga, who played with me every day in our house, came over. It was the greatest pain I had during my whole childhood, that she said, I can't come to your house anymore because you are Jewish. I was not aware that having a religion or anything, like most people in my case, that was a different category.
None of this mattered to Friedel and Elizabeth. Friedel's brother and uncles all believed in the Nazi Party, which would pass laws to protect German blood by banning romance between Jews and non-Jews. They banned Friedel from their homes. But Elizabeth meant more to Friedel, so with war imminent, they planned to marry. On the eve of their marriage, Friedel was walking through Berlin at night, and he saw the sky glowing red. As he grew closer, he realized it was the Reichstag burning. They began raising a family together, living life as normally as they could, but life in Germany was no longer normal. Just weeks after their marriage, Elizabeth's father was arrested by the police unit that later became the Gestapo. They were imprisoning people they believed were enemies of the New Order. He spent 6 months in a concentration camp.
Friedel kept a small radio and heard on the English-British news channel that there would be a big attack on Hamburg, where we lived. And I was pregnant with Aryan. And so Friedel said, we have to leave.
They fled to a nearby town where Friedel's family owned a home and stayed there for the next years of the war with his mother and aunts. Air raids became commonplace. News of atrocities grew. At home, the couple faced personal tragedy. Their 8-year-old son Reiner died of polio. Friedel opened a small factory in Montrowitz with a friend and began spending most of his time away from his family.
He really left me alone. I accepted that because I thought he has his company there, and I never revolted against anything, you know. And he apparently then fell in love with the owner of the daughter of the hotel, the owner. But I didn't know it.
But then, during a visit to Friedel with their children, Elizabeth realized something had come between them.
There was no room for me somehow. I had no idea, of course, that there was a woman involved. So anyway, when Friedel confessed to me that he fell in love with this woman, and that I said, then we have to divorce.
Really?
I just said that. And he said, yeah, I think she comes to, perhaps to America, and then I marry her.
Really?
And now I want to know what can happen to all this love and break up in that way.
Alone, betrayed, and still devastated by the loss of her son, she turned to another man recently released from the concentration camps, briefly passing through town on a train. All I knew was that I was wanted, and this made me happy, she wrote. But the encounter left her feeling even worse, and it never happened again. Elizabeth, Friedel, and their families escaped to America, and the couple divorced. Friedel worked in the U.S. under Elizabeth's father and brothers. He wasn't happy with the arrangement, but he stuck it out to provide for their children. Over time, though, Elizabeth and Friedel drifted back together.
My parents were in Brazil on a business trip, and I was alone in the house, and Friedel called me, and he said, would you consider to go to a movie with me? And my heart started to beat. I was still remember that. I said, yes, I would. Then we went to a movie, and Friedel took my hand, and then I collapsed. And then we went home and remarried.
And they lived happily together again for 10 years. They were surrounded by loved ones, and they were free from the fears that shaped their lives in Nazi Germany. At her father's 80th birthday party, Friedel stood up from the table to give a speech. He kissed Elizabeth. He then sat back down at the table, and he collapsed and he died. Elizabeth Pschorr lives in Northern California now. The presence of those she's lost, her husband and her son, feel very much alive in her home. Next to her bed on the nightstand when we visited, there was a box full of letters. The letters Friedel wrote to her and she to Friedel in those early years. She told us that in this quieter time of her life, the late hours of the day are often spent reading them and trying to understand exactly what love is. For Boing Boing, I'm Shani Jardin.